Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow journey back to a time of gas lamps, horse-drawn carriages, and some truly magnificent facial hair. We're heading to the heart of the Victorian era, a period often associated with strict prudishness and staid formality. But beneath that buttoned-up exterior, there was a surprising vein of playful eccentricity, especially in the world of fashion. Tonight, so wonderfully niche, you might wonder if I'm making it up, when Victorian dandies wore tiny teacups as hats. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine, if you will, a gentleman, impeccably dressed, strolling down a bustling London street, and perched jauntily on his head a gentle chuckle, which is exactly the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to a bustling, foggy London street, perhaps Fleet Street, circa 1880. The air is thick with the scent of coal, smoke, damp earth, and the faint, sweet perfume of horse-drawn cabs. Top hats bob along like dark, polished mushrooms, and bonnets adorned with feathers flutter like exotic birds. He's leaning against a lamppost, adjusting his monocle, his waistcoat a riot of intricate embroidery. And there it is, not a conventional bowler, nor a towering top hat, but a delicate, almost doll-sized teacup, perfectly balanced on his carefully coiffed hair. It gleams faintly in the gaslight, a tiny ceramic anomaly in a sea of felt and silk. It's certainly a conversation starter. While often perceived as rigid, was actually incredibly diverse and prone to flamboyant, even whimsical, trends, particularly among the elite and those striving for social distinction. This era saw the rise of intricate accessories, bold patterns, and an overall emphasis on personal expression through clothing, even for men. The quirky tidbit, however, is the very specific, almost defiant absurdity of the miniature teacup hat. This wasn't just a small hat. It was an object deliberately chosen for its domestic, often feminine, associations, then repurposed as a statement of male sartorial rebellion. Imagine the audacity. It certainly wasn't about practicality. It was about being noticed, about injecting a dose of surreal humor into the otherwise serious business of being a Victorian. Or if it was a more isolated, exaggerated fashion statement, perhaps even a form of performance art on the streets of London. Regardless, its existence speaks volumes about a hidden, playful side of Victorian society that we rarely encounter in the history books. You'd certainly pause in your hurried stroll to get a second look, wouldn't you? It's enough to make you wonder what other delightful oddities were hiding in plain sight. As you marvel at the audacity of the teacup hat, you start to understand that it wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but rather a playful symptom of a much larger. These were gentlemen who elevated personal style to an art form. Historical fact is that the dandy, as a recognizable social type, had actually emerged much earlier in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with figures like Beau Brummel setting the standard for sartorial elegance and understated perfection. However, by the Victorian era, the dandy had evolved, while still emphasizing impeccable tailoring and quality fabrics. The Victorian dandy often embraced a more elaborate, even flamboyant style than his Georgian predecessors. You would see them in velvet waistcoats, intricate cravats, and sometimes, yes, a tiny teacup perched on their head. It was a statement that they had the leisure, the income, and frankly, the nerve to indulge in such self-expression. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some Victorian dandies weren't just about clothes. They cultivated an entire persona that bordered on performance art. They might carry peculiar walking sticks, have pet tortoises on leashes, or engage in deliberately obscure conversations in public. The teacup hat, then, fits perfectly into this broader theatricality. It wasn't just about what you wore, but how you wore it, the subtle irony. Confidence required to wear a miniature ceramic vessel on your head and carry it off with aplomb. It definitely wasn't for the shy. Historians still argue whether the dandy, or simply an aesthetic indulgence of the privileged few. Was it a deeper philosophical statement about individualism, or just a really, really expensive hobby? Regardless, their influence on fashion, both mainstream and avant-garde, was undeniable. You see them striding down the street, their presence, a soft, elegant counterpoint to the grimy realities of London. Their very existence was a form of gentle rebellion, and the teacup hat was just one of their more whimsical weapons in the fight against blandness. Stepping back from the specific whimsy of the teacup hat, you begin to grasp the broader context of Victorian fashion, which, despite its reputation for somber restraint, was surprisingly experimental and often embraced extremes. The teacup hat, in its own miniature way, was just one tiny part of a much larger sartorial tapestry that often bordered on the fantastical, polemic, STREAM. Historical fact is that the Victorian era saw an explosion of fashion trends, driven by increased access to new materials, manufacturing techniques, and the rapid dissemination of ideas through fashion plates and magazines. And ornamentation reached dizzying heights. You'd see dresses adorned with intricate lace, ribbons, ruffles, and elaborate embroidery. It was a time of merismore, a visual feast of fabric and embellishment. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded drawing room in a skirt so wide you'd need your own postal code. Now, for a quirky tidbit, this maximalist tendency wasn't confined to women's wear. While men's formal attire, like the morning coat or frock coat, might seem conservative to modern eyes, they often featured incredibly rich fabrics, hidden linings of vibrant silk, and exquisitely tailored details. Accessories were paramount: elaborate watch chains, jeweled tie pins, and, of course, hats that often reached impressive heights or sported unusual shapes. The teacup hat, then, fits into this spirit of pushing boundaries, even for gentlemen. It was an almost satirical nod to the era's love for excess, taking a domestic object and elevating it to a peculiar fashion statement. Imagine a gentleman with a top hat so tall it nearly grazed the gas lamp, or a waistcoat so heavily embroidered it felt like a portable tapestry. The teacup hat, by contrast, was a quiet, almost subversive. Extreme historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with elaborate dress was a reflection of the era's material prosperity, a means of rigid social stratification, or an escape from the perceived drabness of industrial life. Was it a genuine expression of artistic creativity, or simply a show of wealth and status? Regardless, the sheer variety and occasional outlandishness of Victorian attire certainly makes our modern minimalist wardrobes seem a tad dull by comparison. You'd certainly never be bored observing the fashion choices on a Victorian street, constantly surprised by the new and unusual ways people found to adorn themselves as you mentally navigate the labyrinthine ruffles and towering hats of Victorian fashion. You begin to discern a curious underlying aesthetic that made the teacup hat. This was an era utterly charmed by the miniature, the intricate fascination for objects that were small, intricate, and often highly detailed. Think about dollhouses, which became incredibly elaborate, replicating grand homes down to the tiniest chandelier, or miniature paintings, often portraits, so small they could be worn as lockets. There was a widespread appreciation for craftsmanship on a tiny scale, a delight in seeing familiar objects rendered with precision in a diminutive form. You would see display cases filled with tiny silver thimbles, miniature porcelain figurines, or exquisitely carved bone objects, all admired for their delicate artistry. Now for a quirky tidbit. This miniaturization trend wasn't just confined to static objects, it extended to fashion. Women's hats, for example, often featured tiny birds, sometimes even real taxidermied ones, miniature flowers, or tiny velvet bows, all meticulously arranged. So, the leap to a miniature teacup, complete with its tiny handle and painted details, wasn't as outlandish as it might first seem within this context. It was taking a beloved domestic item, itself a symbol of refinement and leisure, and shrinking it to a wearable, whimsical scale. Imagine holding a tiny teacup in your hand, perfectly formed, but barely big enough for a thimbleful of tea. The appeal was in its impracticality, its delightful absurdity. Historians still argue whether this fascination with miniaturization was a nostalgic longing for a simpler, more controllable world in an era of rapid industrial change, or if it was simply a natural extension of technological advancements, allowing for more precise manufacturing. Was it a psychological comfort, or just good marketing for new forms of consumer goods? And the quaint held a powerful appeal, paving the way for something as inherently playful as a teacup hat. You wouldn't just appreciate the hat, you'd appreciate the tiny, delicate craft of it, recognizing it as a small masterpiece of whimsical design. Having established the Victorian era's fondness for the delightfully diminutive, your mind naturally turns to the very essence of the teacup hat, its construction. How on earth did they transform delicate porcelain and fragile adornments into something wearable, even if only for a playful statement? The answer lies in surprisingly ingenious, if often precarious, craftsmanship. A mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era was a period of immense innovation in material science and manufacturing, even for seemingly trivial fashion accessories. While the teacup itself would have been genuine porcelain or fine china, the attachment methods were key. Hat makers would often employ strong adhesives, early forms of glues, often animal-based, though surprisingly robust, fine wire, and a variety of lightweight, yet sturdy, foundations to secure the teacup. You wouldn't just plop a teacup on your head and hope for the best. It had to be fastened. Imagine a tiny internal frame, perhaps of very thin metal or buckram, carefully shaped to cradle the teacup and provide points for attachment. Now for a quirky tidbit to ensure the teacup remained upright and jaunty. Hat designers sometimes incorporated hidden pins or even small hair-gripping combs directly onto the teacup's base or rim. These weren't visible when worn, but allowed the wearer to subtly anchor the ceramic piece to their hair or a slightly larger, unseen hat foundation. Picture a dandy meticulously adjusting his hair, perhaps using a dab of pomade to ensure that tiny teacup sat at precisely the right, slightly askew angle. It sounds like a delicate balancing act, doesn't it? One sudden gust of wind, and you might find yourself retrieving your headwear from a puddle. Historians still argue whether the primary concern in the construction of these hats was durability, given their fragile nature, or simply the aesthetic effect. Was the engineering robust enough for everyday wear, or were they truly meant for fleeting, sheltered appearances? Regardless, the very act of making a teacup wearable speaks to a certain ingenuity. You'd marvel at the miniature artistry, the tiny painted scenes on the porcelain, perhaps a microscopic landscape or a minuscule bouquet of flowers. The tactile experience would be one of smooth, cool ceramic against the warmth of your scalp, a constant, gentle reminder of the absurdity and charm of your chosen headwear. It certainly makes you wonder about the logistics of ordering such a bespoke item from your local HAB. Having established the Victorian era's fondness for the delightfully diminutive, your mind naturally turns to the very essence of the teacup hat, its construction. How on earth did they transform delicate porcelain and fragile adornments into something wearable, even if only for a playful statement? The answer lies in surprisingly ingenious, if often precarious, craftsmanship. A mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era was a period of immense innovation in material science and manufacturing, even for seemingly trivial fashion accessories. While the teacup itself would have been genuine porcelain or fine china, the attachment methods were key. Hat makers would often employ strong adhesives, early forms of glues, often animal-based, though surprisingly robust, fine wire, and a variety of lightweight, yet sturdy, foundations to secure the teacup. You wouldn't just plop a teacup on your head and hope for the best. It had to be fastened. Imagine a tiny internal frame, perhaps of very thin metal or buckram, carefully shaped to cradle the teacup and provide points for attachment. Now for a quirky tidbit to ensure the teacup remained upright and jaunty. Hat designers sometimes incorporated hidden pins or even small hair-gripping combs directly onto the teacup's base or rim. These weren't visible when worn, but allowed the wearer to subtly anchor the ceramic piece to their hair or a slightly larger, unseen hat foundation. Picture a dandy meticulously adjusting his hair, perhaps using a dab of pomade to ensure that tiny teacup sat at precisely the right, slightly askew angle. It sounds like a delicate balancing act, doesn't it? One sudden gust of wind, and you might find yourself retrieving your headwear from a puddle. Historians still argue whether the primary concern in the construction of these hats was durability, given their fragile nature, or simply the aesthetic effect. Was the engineering robust enough for everyday wear, or were they truly meant for fleeting, sheltered appearances? Regardless, the very act of making a teacup wearable speaks to a certain ingenuity. You'd marvel at the miniature artistry, the tiny painted scenes on the porcelain, perhaps a microscopic landscape or a minuscule bouquet of flowers. The tactile experience would be one of smooth, cool ceramic against the warmth of your scalp, a constant, gentle reminder of the absurdity and charm of your chosen headwear. It certainly makes you wonder about the logistics of ordering such a bespoke item from your local HABERDASHER. Beyond the materials and ingenious construction chosen to evoke a specific impression. It was less about practical headwear and more about a sartorial wink, a subtle act of playful defiance that spoke volumes about the wearer's wit and confidence. You weren't just wearing a hat, you were telling a story. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian fashion, particularly for men, was often used as a powerful tool for social signaling. The quality of your suit, the cut of your coat, the sheen of your boots, all communicated your status, profession, and aspirations. A well-dressed gentleman commanded respect and attention. The teacup hat, however, subverted this seriousness with a dose of whimsical irony. It wasn't about projecting traditional power. It was about projecting a very specific, knowing brand of individuality. Imagine a gentleman in an otherwise perfectly tailored suit, and then the delightful surprise of the teacup hat, turning a staid ensemble into a momentary tableau of quiet rebellion. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the teacup hat, by repurposing an object traditionally associated with domesticity and femininity, also carried a subtle, almost subversive hint of challenging gender norms. In an era of strict gender roles, a man wearing a teacup on his head was playfully blurring lines, asserting a kind of artistic freedom beyond conventional masculinity. It wasn't overtly flamboyant like drag, but a more subtle, intellectual play on expectations. Imagine the whispered conversations, the curious glances, the knowing smiles exchanged between those who got it and those who were simply bewildered. It was a litmus test for social acuity, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether this cross-gender signaling was a conscious political statement or simply an accidental byproduct of aesthetic playfulness. Was it deliberate gender bending or just an innocent pursuit of the absurd? You'd stride confidently through the crowded streets, acutely aware of the gentle tilt of the teacup on your head, the subtle clinking of the minuscule spoon, if you were daring enough to include one against the porcelain, would be your secret rhythm. Every raised eyebrow, every curious glance would simply affirm your success. You weren't just a man in a hat. You were a walking piece of performance art, a silent joke in a serious world, a testament to the fact that even in the most formal of eras, there was always room for a little bit of delightful, porcelain-topped eccentricity. It was less about keeping your head warm and more about warming up the conversation. You've absorbed the dandy's playful defiance, the subtle subversion of the teacup hat as a social signal. But now you might wonder, how did this delightful absurdity integrate into the very structured daily life of a Victorian gentleman? Was it a permanent fixture or a whimsical, occasional accessory? The practicalities, or rather, the glorious impracticalities, are just as intriguing as the statement itself. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian gentlemen, particularly those of means, adhered to a rigid schedule of social engagements, business dealings, and leisure pursuits. Morning calls, club visits, afternoon strolls in the park, evening dinners. The top hat, for instance, was ubiquitous for formal occasions. and the bowler for more casual daytime wear. You would rarely see a gentleman without appropriate headwear when out of doors. So, the teacup hat, by its very nature, was already stepping outside these established norms. Now for a quirky tidbit. While some dandies might have indeed worn their teacup hats for a full day of peacocking about town, it's more likely that these highly unconventional pieces were reserved for specific occasions where a deliberate statement was desired. Perhaps an afternoon tea party. Oh, the irony. A stroll through a fashionable park to be seen, or a particularly avant-garde artistic salon. Imagine trying to engage in a robust debate at your gentleman's club with a tiny teacup delicately perched on your head. One vigorous nod, and you might find yourself explaining a broken piece of china. It wasn't about all-day wearability. It was about the impactful, fleeting moment of display. Historians still argue whether the teacup hat was primarily a daytime promenade accessory or more suited for indoor social gatherings where its fragility was less of a concern. Was it designed for urban spectacle or for intimate, appreciative audiences? You would find yourself constantly aware of its presence, perhaps gently adjusting it, the delicate ceramic cool against your scalp. Every movement would be considered, every turn of the head executed with a practiced grace to prevent an unfortunate incident. It was a conscious performance, an ongoing piece of street theater, where the hat itself was the star. The wind, sudden jostles from passersby, or even a clumsy handshake could spell disaster for your tiny teacup. It was a commitment, a daily or occasional act of sartorial bravery, proving that the true dandy was willing to suffer minor inconveniences for the sake of unparalleled style. Section 8. The appearance of a gentleman sporting a teacup on his head would, predictably, elicit a range of reactions from the buttoned-up Victorian public. While dandies aimed for nonchalant sophistication, the sheer oddity of the teacup hat was bound to provoke everything from amused smiles to bewildered stares, and occasionally outright ridicule. You weren't just walking down the street, you were causing a minor sensation. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian society, despite its pockets of eccentricity, generally valued decorum and adherence to established social norms, particularly in public appearance. Deviations from expected attire could draw significant attention, and not always the kind one desired. Fashion magazines and satirical publications of the era often lampooned outlandish styles, serving as a social policing mechanism. So, a dandy with a teacup hat was essentially daring the public to react. Imagine the hushed whispers, the pointing fingers, the sudden stopping of conversations as you passed by. It was a silent challenge to conventionality. Now for a quirky tidbit. While some reactions might have been negative, the dandy often thrived on provoking a response, even if it was ridicule. The teacup hat, being so utterly impractical and whimsical, served as a perfect target for cartoonists and satirists. Imagine a newspaper caricature depicting a bewildered-looking gentleman with a huge, oversized teacup precariously balanced on his head, spilling tea, perhaps, onto his meticulously tied cravat. These visual jokes, far from deterring the dandies, might have even cemented their notoriety and made the teacup hat even more desirable for those seeking to stand out. Historians still argue whether the dandy's deliberate provocation was a sign of genuine artistic expression or merely a self-indulgent quest for attention? Was it a form of subtle social commentary, or just an expensive way to get laughed at? You would cultivate an air of serene indifference, a practiced aloofness that belied the internal satisfaction of causing such a stir. Your perfectly trimmed mustache might twitch slightly at the corner, betraying a hint of a smile, but outwardly you would remain utterly unfazed. The clatter of hooves, the cries of newsboys, and the general hubbub of the city would fade into a distant hum as the immediate, visible reactions to your headwear took center stage. It was a brave act, perhaps even a defiant one, to wear something so inherently absurd in a society that valued gravity. And in doing so, the dandy truly owned the peculiar space they carved out for themselves in the Victorian landscape. As the teacup hat bobbed along the fashionable streets, its unique charm wasn't just confined to the dandies who dared to wear it. In subtle, often unexpected ways, the eccentricities championed by these trendsetters began to ripple outwards, influencing broader Victorian fashion and challenging rigid sartorial boundaries. You see, even a tiny teacup can cast a long shadow, a mainstream. Historical fact is that fashion trends, even the most avant-garde, rarely remain isolated. Elements of high fashion, even if initially ridiculed, often filter down or inspire adaptations in more mainstream attire. The dandy, with his emphasis on impeccable tailoring, quality fabrics, and attention to detail, inadvertently raised the bar for men's fashion across the board. While most gentlemen wouldn't dan a teacup, the general appreciation for fine waistcoats, artfully tied cravats, and polished boots was undoubtedly influenced by the dandy aesthetic. Imagine seeing a particularly stylish dandy and then noticing how certain elements of his ensemble, perhaps a richer fabric or a bolder pattern, start appearing in more conventional clothing a few seasons later. Now for a quirky tidbit, the teacup hat, specifically, might have subtly contributed to the Victorian era's ongoing fascination with novelty in women's hats. While men's headwear remained largely conservative, save for the dandies' antics, women's hats became veritable gardens, sporting everything from elaborate floral arrangements to miniature birds, fruits, and even tiny landscapes. The idea of placing an unexpected decorative object atop one's head, even if for different reasons, found a parallel in the teacup hat. It blurred the lines between headwear and decoration, almost turning the head into a display stand for whimsical objects. Historians still argue whether the extreme ornamentation of women's hats was genuinely inspired by dandy eccentricity, or if both trends emerged independently from a broader Victorian aesthetic of elaborate adornment. Was it cross-gender influence, or simply parallel evolution in a maximalist age? You would observe this gradual shift, perhaps noticing a more daring pattern on a gentleman's tie that wasn't there last season, or a subtly more flamboyant cufflink. The teacup hat, in its quiet, ceramic way, had nudged the needle of what was considered acceptable, expanding the visual vocabulary of Victorian dress. It could also be about playfulness, wit, and a touch of delightful absurdity. The very presence of such an unusual item on a gentleman's head encouraged a softer view of sartorial innovation. The teacup hat, with its deliberate juxtaposition of masculine formality and feminine domesticity, sparks a fascinating thought. How did it engage with, or even subtly challenge the rigid gender roles so prevalent in Victorian society. You see, fashion, even in its most seemingly trivial forms, can often be a quiet battleground for social norms of mainstream. Historical fact is that Victorian society operated under very defined gender roles, often summed up by the concept of separate spheres. Men occupied the public sphere of work, politics, and business, while women were largely confined to the private, domestic sphere of home and family. This division was reflected profoundly in fashion, with men's clothing emphasizing practicality and seriousness, and women's attire favoring elaborate decoration and less practical silhouettes. You would rarely see overt crossover in clothing styles. Imagine the shock if a woman wore a top hat or trousers on the street. Now for a quirky tidbit, the teacup hat, domestic object, a teacup onto a traditionally masculine head, introduced a subtle, almost subversive element of gender fluidity into the Dandies ensemble. It wasn't about fully adopting female dress, but about playfully borrowing an object and recontextualizing it in a way that questioned the strict boundaries. It injected a delicate, almost vulnerable element into the otherwise stern image of a Victorian gentleman. Imagine the raised eyebrows, the quiet whispers. Was this gentleman making a statement about his aesthetic sensibilities or something more? Historians still argue whether such fashion choices were a conscious proto-feminist statement or simply an unthinking embrace of novel aesthetics without deeper social intent. Was it a deliberate challenge to gender norms or simply a dandy being a dandy? You would observe the curious reactions, noticing how the teacup hat forced onlookers to reconsider their assumptions. It invited a moment of pause, a slight cognitive dissonance, as a masculine figure wore an object typically found on a lace-trimmed tea table. It blurred the edges, softened the sharp lines of gendered expectations, if only for a fleeting moment. This wasn't about political marches or suffrage movements. It was a quieter form of cultural commentary, a gentle nudge against the rigid walls of convention, demonstrating that even in an era of strict separation, there was always room for a little porcelain-topped rebellion. Beyond the social and gendered implications, the teacup hat also taps into a broader, perhaps more subconscious, Victorian phenomenon, the cult of the small. This was an era utterly enamored with miniature objects, where tiny replicas and delicate curiosities held a powerful, almost enchanting appeal. The teacup hat was just one charming manifestation of this widespread fascination. A mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian period saw the widespread popularization of collecting hobbies, with a strong emphasis on small, intricate items. Think of thimbles, snuff boxes, miniature portrait lockets, or tiny porcelain figurines that adorned every mantelpiece. The development of precision manufacturing allowed for the creation of incredibly detailed items on a diminutive scale, making these objects accessible to a wider public. You would see drawing rooms filled with glass cases displaying carefully arranged collections of tiny treasures, each admired for its exquisite craftsmanship and minute detail. Now, for a quirky tidbit, this cult of the small also extended to nature, with a craze for miniature gardens inside glass cases, known as Wardian cases, or even tiny collections of pressed flowers or insects. The teacup hat, by transforming a functional, albeit elegant, object into a purely decorative miniature form, aligned perfectly with this aesthetic. It turned a head into a tiny display stand, showcasing a delicate, scaled-down version of a household item. Imagine the delight in seeing a perfectly formed miniature rosebud in a tiny porcelain vase, or a minuscule, intricately painted bird on a lady's bonnet. The teacup hat brought that same sense of intimate wonder to masculine attire. Historians still argue whether this fascination with miniaturization was a psychological escape from the overwhelming scale of industrialization and urban growth, or if it simply reflected new technological capabilities and consumer trends. Was it a retreat into a manageable world, or a celebration of detailed artistry? You would find yourself drawn to the hat's delicate proportions, its precise, miniature detailing, the smooth curve of the teacup, the almost invisible join where it met its base, the tiny, perfectly formed handle. Each element contributed to its peculiar charm. It was a tactile and visual delight, inviting closer inspection and fostering a sense of intimate appreciation in a world that was rapidly becoming larger and more impersonal. The teacup hat was not just a fashion statement. It was a tiny, wearable monument to the Victorian love affair with all things miniature. You've admired the craft, understood the social signals, and appreciated the miniature magic. But like all fashion phenomena, even the most delightfully eccentric, the teacup hat was destined to have its moment in the sun before fading into the annals of sartorial history. Its decline was gradual, influenced by shifting tastes and the relentless march of modernity. A mainstream historical fact is that fashion is inherently cyclical and rarely remains static for long. Trends, no matter how popular or niche, eventually give way to new aesthetics, often in reaction to the excesses or perceived staleness of the preceding style. The dandy movement itself, which championed such eccentricities, began to evolve. By the late Victorian and early Edwardian periods, men's fashion largely moved towards greater practicality, simplicity, and a more understated elegance. The elaborate waistcoats gave way to more sober suits, and the flamboyant cravats were replaced by simpler ties. You would notice a gradual streamlining of silhouettes, a less is more approach beginning to take hold. Now for a quirky tidbit: the very impracticality and fragility of the teacup hat likely contributed to its eventual decline. Imagine the constant worry of breaking your headwear, the need for delicate handling, and the sheer awkwardness of trying to wear it in anything but the most controlled environments. As life became faster-paced and more practical, a hat that required such careful attention simply wasn't sustainable for everyday wear. Think of trying to board a hansom cab or navigate a crowded train station with a tiny porcelain cup precariously balanced on your head. It sounds like a recipe for constant, mild disaster, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the decline of such specific whimsical accessories was primarily driven by changing aesthetic preferences or by the increasing pace and practical demands of modernizing urban life. Was it a shift in taste, or simply a matter of convenience? You would observe the gradual disappearance of these delightful oddities from the streets. Fewer and fewer gentlemen would risk the porcelain headwear. The novelty would wear off, and new forms of expression would emerge. The teacup hat, once a bold statement, would slowly recede into memory, becoming a quirky footnote in the grand tapestry of Victorian eccentricity. It wasn't a dramatic exit, more of a gentle, quiet fading, like the last wisp of steam from a forgotten teacup on a cool morning dot. Despite the teacup hat's charmingly brief moment in the Victorian sun, its spirit, and indeed the broader influence of dandyism, have left a subtle yet persistent legacy in modern dress. You might not see miniature teacups on heads today, but the echoes of those sartorial rebels can still be glimpsed in contemporary fashion. A mainstream historical fact is that historical fashion trends frequently inspire modern designers who often reinterpret past styles for new audiences. The dandy's insistence on impeccable tailoring, attention to detail, and the notion of clothes as a form of personal art rather than mere covering continues to influence high fashion and bespoke menswear. You see the legacy in the resurgence of classic suit cuts, the emphasis on quality fabrics, and the enduring appeal of tailored accessories. Imagine a modern fashion show, and you might spot a dramatic cravat or a boldly patterned waistcoat that feels like a direct nod to a Victorian antecedent, albeit updated for the 21st century. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the teacup hat specifically resonates with the contemporary trend of microbags or impractical miniature accessories. Think of handbags so tiny they can barely hold a credit card, worn as a playful, often ironic, fashion statement rather than for utility. This fascination with the deliberately non-functional, the whimsical, and the delightfully small as an accessory echoes the very essence of the teacup hat. It's about carrying or wearing something for its aesthetic value and conversational potential, not its practicality. Imagine a celebrity carrying a tiny, impossibly small purse, and you're seeing the spirit of the teacup hat. Historians still argue whether these modern root microtrends are a conscious historical homage or an independent resurgence of the cult of the small driven by new consumer aesthetics. Is it a direct lineage or just parallel evolution? You would find yourself recognizing these subtle callbacks, a flash of recognition in a particularly artful scarf or an unusually ornate pocket square. The teacup hat, in its own charmingly absurd way, proved that fashion doesn't always have to be about strict utility. It can be about joy, about wit, about a gentle rebellion against the mundane. Its legacy lives on, not in exact replication, but in the enduring idea that clothing can be a canvas for humor, a stage for personality, and a quiet, whimsical challenge to the everyday. The Victorian dandy, with his tiny teacup, reminds us that fashion is, and always has been, a wonderfully playful thing. Having traced the teacup hat's brief but memorable journey through Victorian fashion, you're left with a sense of its enduring whimsy. It's a delightful reminder that history, especially fashion history, is full of charming peculiarities that defy easy categorization. This tiny hat wasn't just about covering a head. It was about covering it with a question mark. A mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era, for all its innovations and progress, was also deeply sentimental and held a strong affection for the quaint and the nostalgic. Objects, even frivolous ones, often carried layers of meaning. The teacup, as a symbol, evoked domesticity, refinement, and the comforting ritual of afternoon tea. By placing it on a gentleman's head, the dandy wasn't just being silly. He was subtly playing with these established cultural symbols, twisting them into something new and ironic. You would feel a tug of familiarity with the teacup itself, perhaps reminding you of your own grandmother's china cabinet, even as its placement on a hat challenged every expectation. You would find yourself smiling at the sheer audacity and gentle humor of it all. The teacup hat stands as a testament to an era that, despite its serious facade, knew how to appreciate a good, quiet joke. It was a small rebellion, a whisper of absurdity in a loud world, a reminder that even the most formal attire could harbor a secret, delightful eccentricity. It wasn't about keeping the rain off your head. It was about raining down a little bit of unexpected charm on everyone who saw it. Section 15. As our journey through the charmingly peculiar world of the Victorian dandy and his teacup hat draws to a close, you're left with a soft, lingering image of unexpected elegance and quiet wit. It's a testament to the enduring human desire to express individuality, even through the most delightfully improbable means. A mainstream historical fact is that fashion, throughout history, has always been a mirror reflecting society's values, anxieties, and aspirations, often in the most curious ways. The teacup hat, as we've seen, encapsulates a fascinating blend of Victorian precision, a love for the miniature, and a subtle, knowing humor. It wasn't just about covering one's head. It was about adding a layer of unexpected narrative to one's public persona. You've walked the bustling streets of London, felt the imagined weight of porcelain on a coiffed head, and heard the faint whispers of curiosity from passers-by. Now for a quirky tidbit. Consider the sheer delightful impracticality of it all. In an era that was rapidly embracing efficiency and mass production, the teacup hat stood as a quiet rebellion, a handcrafted, fragile emblem of individuality. It wasn't designed for comfort or utility, but for pure, unadulterated aesthetic joy. This embrace of beautiful uselessness is a concept that still resonates, reminding us that sometimes the most charming things are those that serve no purpose other than to make us smile. Imagine the gentle pride in wearing something so utterly unique, knowing that you were part of a very select, very whimsical club. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind such eccentric fashions was artistic expression or a form of social distinction in an increasingly crowded world. Was it pure style or a subtle statement of class? You can now let that image, soft and slightly absurd, float gently away. The clatter of hooves, the cries of vendors, and the subtle clink of a tiny spoon against porcelain are fading into the quiet of your own space. Allow yourself to feel the gentle ease of this historical reverie, recognizing the universal human thread of finding joy and expression in unexpected places. The Victorian dandy, with his whimsical teacup hat, offers a final, silent nod of eccentric charm.